Greg is in New York. You're on Free Talk Live with Ian and Daryl.
Hey guys, how's the weekend?
It's
Almost
not
here.
yet the weekend. We're here at work, and we will work through the weekend. But go ahead with your thoughts.
I wanted to address the question of what are our rights with the Scottish secession now, I guess, behind us. There was a chance that Scotland, at least part of Scotland, might secede. And I wanted to ask if you guys, I know you're talking about seceding possibly, if you were able to form your own land, what would be the rights that how would you set up the government? Because if New Hampshire seceded, it would still be a state. It would still have a government, still be, have a lot of cities. So wouldn't that still be bad?
Well, yeah, any centralized monopoly is a bad thing, but one that is closer to home is better than one that's 1,000 miles away. Hang on, we can talk about rights here in a moment if you'd like. I'd be happy to. I think that's an interesting discussion because a lot of people don't really understand rights, and we can get into that coming up here in the third hour of Free Talk Live, which is next. Greg is in Brooklyn, New York. And Greg, you'd called in to talk about the idea of rights and secession. So go ahead and sort of recap for listeners just tuning in because you just barely got started right before we had to go to the news.
Right. So, we have this idea that what if you were able to secede, to quit it all and get your own land, and you would have, let's say, a lot of land, and you would have to share with other people. How would you run that area? How would it be organized? And whatever the system was, what is your conception of rights? Because from what I understand, if you're a libertarian or like an American-style libertarian, like anarcho-capitalist, then you would really be into property. So can you explain, where does the right to property come from? Why is that right? Are there any other rights besides that one?
So you've hit a whole bunch of things there in that statement and the question. Well, we can talk about rights and but briefly to answer your question about secession. If New Hampshire were to secede tomorrow, New Hampshire already has a government set up. There's already a constitution here. And as all things considered, the New Hampshire Constitution's a pretty decent one. It's got a right to revolution in it, the right to conscience. There's a number of useful things in there. I'm sure, Daryl, you have a few favorites as well.
I do love the right to conscience, the supposed right to revolution, even though, no matter how many times it gets brought up in court, the judge just sort of glosses over and, well, there were rights that were mentioned, but because you didn't file certain papers, then I don't have to consider those, and you didn't delve into why you believe that right applies.
Sure.
And, of course, you couldn't delve into it because you didn't file papers saying that you wanted to bring a constitutional claim. So, therefore, I just have to, acknowledge that you mentioned it.
So the government is already existing in New Hampshire. We would be lopping off the federal government, and then we can deal with changing the New Hampshire government as time goes on. I mean, the difference between what we have with New Hampshire and what might be an ideal for a voluntarist is, there's a lot to be done there. But I think just getting out from underneath the thumb of the federal government,
removing one layer of government is a good start.
Would be a nice start. But let's get into the issue of rights, because I think that's really important. And you were talking about property. And by the way, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I don't necessarily support one economic system of organization over another. And I certainly am not an anarchist because I don't support the idea of no rules. I don't have a problem with rules. And I think that the term anarchy has a suggestion of no rules, even if the actual definition means no rulers. I'm also in favor of self-rule, so to have no ruler would mean I wouldn't be ruling myself, and so therefore that doesn't make sense.
What does that mean, by the way, to own yourself or to rule yourself? I've always wondered what is meant by that.
What do you think is meant by that?
I think, well, to me that sounds very much like a slogan, like right to life or right to choose. Like, it doesn't mean much when you get into the details, but I could be wrong.
Do I own you?
No, but I mean,
does someone else own you?
What is ownership? What does that mean?
Ownership generally means control over something.
Well, nobody has absolute control over anyone.
Frequently exclusive control. Generally, most people would acknowledge they have control over themselves, that they own themselves.
We're interdependent. To some extent, if I have a family, we're more interdependent on each other.
Sure, we all are interdependent. We have to interact with one another to continue to exist. No one is an island, and if you try to go it alone, it's not going to work out very well for you in life.
Right.
But the idea that you don't own yourself is, I think, a pretty ridiculous concept. You're the one who has your own volition. You're the one getting out of bed in the morning. You're the one making choices. So it's pretty clear to me that you own yourself. Whether you agree with that or not, that's
no. I agree. I just don't understand what that sentence means. I mean, of course, I have freedom to choose certain things within my resources, and if that means I own myself, then very well. Okay.
Back to the issue of rights. Your question was basically what are rights, who decides what rights are. Can you kind of refresh me on the question of rights?
Yeah, basically, what is I have a conception of rights, but I wanted to hear, what is your conception of rights? And are there any other rights? Who decides basically what are rights?
Oh yeah, and you'd asked about property as well. You'd asked about the idea of property, because you don't buy into the whole property thing from my understanding of conversations with you previously.
I want to be very clear, like Obama says. I want to be very clear. I respect property rights, but I also respect other rights, and I think that rights are protections given by government, and they have to be balanced against each other.
Totally disagree. I don't think rights are given by government. I think rights are an agreement between human beings that came about because they work, because it makes sense. So the idea of a right to life. You have the right to life because we value living, and it's better, as you were saying, to work together with people. But if you're going to be alive, it helps to have people around to help get things done, that you can distribute different people are good at different tasks, etc. But anyway, the idea of a right to life is something that you want to grant to others in the hopes that they'll grant it to you, so we can continue working together to make a better life together. If you don't respect the right to life, then someone might go ahead and take your life. If a bunch of people didn't respect the right to life, then you'd be constantly on the defense from attackers. We don't have that situation today. It's not a dog-eat-dog world, so to speak, because humans have come to the conclusion that it makes more sense to cooperate and to live together peacefully with people generally. Obviously, there are psychopaths who don't believe in the right to life, but the super
and they generally have badges.
Well, that's sometimes true, but
not a lot of them have a sense of duty.
So that's one example of a right, and then the other examples, you were talking about government granting rights. Again, that's not true.
No, not rights. Government granting protection, not rights at all. That's what I meant. I want to know what other rights besides life and property do you consider to be legitimate? Because, even right and property should be balanced against each other. Like in a hypothetical world where there was one guy with a lot of things that people needed, and nobody else had that, and there was, let's say, 10 people in this world, and suddenly there was a famine, and he had all the food. I think his right to property would, at that point, have to be balanced with their right to life. So I think it would be legitimate to take some of his food in order to perpetuate the life of other people.
If there are only 10 people left in the world, then I'm sure that those people can find food elsewhere other than stealing from one man that has it.
Yeah, right. You have to go to some ridiculous, impossible scenario to even try to make the point that you're making here. No, it's not okay to steal from people. It's not okay to kill that guy, to take his food from him so you can continue living. Your right to life ends at the other people's rights, right? It ends at violating those other people's rights. But again, not everybody agrees on what should be a right and what shouldn't be a right. And that's why I think rights are nothing more than agreement between humans. So not everybody agrees with the idea of property. Property is just an idea that has come up. It's convenient. It's a good idea. It helps define who has what and who has a right to what and who can operate what.
So, Greg, let me ask you this question. In your ideal world, would there be some kind of computer that allocates things to people?
Well, first of all, I don't think there is an ideal world, and I'm not looking for one. But in a world, I think that we live in and one that could be better, and where we're going, I think, computers will take over a lot of government
Do you support the Venus Project?
I heard about it. I'm certainly for the sustainable. I think capitalism should become sustainable.
We'll come back with more in moments. Free Talk Live. What are rights? Are they something given to you by a creator? Are they given to you by government? Or is it just a good idea between people that helps humans interact with one another? I think the latter is the case. I think that rights are pretty valuable, and that it's taken time to figure out this whole rights thing. We may not have figured it all out completely yet. We'll continue with the discussion here. I'm glad Greg brought it up. He's still on the line with us here. The toll-free number is 855-450-FREE if you'd like to jump into the conversation. Also, there's our Skype username, which is lrn.fm. And, of course, your right to pursue happiness should be pretty much unstoppable, so long as your right to pursue happiness doesn't infringe upon somebody else's right to life or whatever. So obviously, if you get happy by killing people, sorry, you don't have a right to pursue happiness in that way, because it would infringe on other people's rights. As we continue here talking about rights with Greg in Brooklyn. And Greg, I think we may have somebody on the line here who wants to talk to you. We've got Justice on the line in Siberia. Justice, are you with us?
Yes, sir. Here I am.
Okay, I have you on with Greg in Brooklyn. Did you want to converse with him?
Well, actually, I was, yeah, sure. I was actually calling in kind of in response to a point he brought up, I think, last week, about force versus violence, and it kind of ties into the whole concept of rights and stuff. So just let me kind of give my little spiel, and then just hear what Greg has to say back. You brought up a really good point the other day about how all property is. Your point was that all property is based in some kind of violence, basically, like the libertarian voluntarist position being that we shouldn't aggress and all that kind of stuff. And you were saying that all property is kind of based in violence. And I'd like to take issue with that and basically say that no, I think that property fundamentally is not based in violence. Property, there's force involved in property. All property is backed by the potential of force, but that force doesn't equal violence. Violence in its nature is the initiation of aggression. And the difference between a system based on property rights and voluntary interaction, the difference between that and a system of forced redistribution is that the system of property rights and voluntary interaction can work without force. Just because I don't lock my door does not necessarily mean someone's going to walk in and walk away with my stuff. It might, but it doesn't mean. In a system of forced redistribution that you're pretty consistently propagating, if you stop the violence, if you stop the aggression of the state, the whole system comes undone. I'm living in post-Soviet Russia, and talking to the old timers here, the people who lived through the Soviet period, they sing the praises of the great Soviet system and the Soviet man and the wonderful utopia that it was. But when the violence stopped, things just went to hell. In the 90s, I lived here in Russia through the entire 90s period, and it was pretty incredibly terrible. And the reason for that was because the entire system was based on violence. So that's the observation that I had there.
Justice, I want to thank you for the call tonight, man. Kind of an iffy connection from you on Skype. I appreciate it, though. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with Greg. Greg, response? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I understand him, man. First of all, I'm from Russia, although I left when I was 1 year old. So it's almost like the mirror image. I grew up in New York. But, listen, first of all, the Soviet regime wasn't exactly socialism either. It was more of a totalitarian regime. They called itself socialism. But regardless,
what was it? But before you go on, okay, this is a common refrain from people who support socialism, is that, oh, well, those other guys in the history did it wrong. Can you name a regime that was a socialist regime in the history of man?
Well, Well, first of all, I'm not in favor of socialism as you think of it. And I'm
you're in favor of it as you think of it. So I'm wondering what you would.
For example, I think the stock market is a form of socializing risk that is very good without any coercion whatsoever. I think it's superior to whatever Karl Marx had in mind. So no, I'm not in favor of any kind of forced redistribution like that. But
what are you in favor of forcing then?
I'm not in favor. I'm saying that you can't get rid of force. And, the caller who just brought this up.
Of course you can't get rid of force. I mean, there will always be humans who are willing to use coercive force against other humans, that of which there's no doubt. I mean, that's going to continue. Even if we were to get rid of the coercion of the state, there would still be individuals who would be willing to use coercion against psychopaths and sociopaths, those people.
Yes, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the system, not the people. See, you're blaming, you're saying there's a few bad apples. If these bad apples weren't using force, everything would be fine. I'm a developer of software, and I have a team. I've learned early on with the team that blaming a developer for, let's say, checking in code that doesn't compile is not a very good thing because you're relying on humans to constantly check everything. Instead, the system is at fault. Have the system check it automatically. The same thing here. You're saying, and, a lot of the 99% blames the 1%, and there's a lot of blame all the time. But really, no system is perfect. There's always going to be force. And in fact, with the laissez-faire system, with the property rights, there's force too, because property is excluding others by force if necessary from some resources. That is what property is. It's a monopoly right.
Do I have a right to climb into your bed whenever I want to?
No, that's the thing. When you start talking about rights, it becomes completely arbitrary. You've decided there are two rights, maybe three: life, property, and pursuit of happiness. Can you list any more?
Well, I think everything falls under those, but you're saying that no one has a right to property, so I'm asking if I can just crawl in your bed because you don't have property because you can't protect your bed.
What I am saying is instead of talking about rights, talk about protection and how the organization can be set up to guarantee those protections to some extent.
As long as it's set up on a consensual basis, it doesn't bother me. Thanks, Greg. There's more coming up here on Free Talk Live. I want to get back to the calls here in a moment, but also just a further comment on, I think, an important distinction that maybe Greg, our caller, who is missing. And I keep Greg on for a lot longer than the average caller because he's challenging. I mean, he's got different ideas that are very different from what we promote here on Free Talk Live, and I like a good challenge. But I think the thing he's missing when he talks about how property is based on force is that property is based on defensive force. So in that, you have the right to defend your property from the encroachment. So you asked the question about, can I just crawl into your bed?
Right, because he said that nobody has a right to own property.
Is that what he said?
He said no one has a right to property because property is based on force.
I see. Well, yeah, I think that property is useful, and we talked about the reasons that it is useful because having these distinctions, having ownership over these things helps to promote those things. When you own something, you're more likely to take care of it. You look at the commons, for instance, the tragedy of the commons, as it's called. Frequently, places that are public or commonly owned are just not taken care of very well.
Right. And if you look at the poorest countries in the world, and you will notice that in a lot of those countries, people do not have a right to own property, which means people don't have a right to develop property, which means that they don't have a right to make things better for themselves.
They don't have as much of an interest in that property, so therefore they're more likely to just do nothing with it.
Well, the countries that I'm thinking of specifically, a lot of the sub-Saharan countries in Africa, where the people do not have a right to own property, so they'll set up these sort of tent towns, and then the government will just come in at random times and drive the people out. So they don't ever have the opportunity to develop the property.
To put down roots, to improve things for the future. And so, again, it's based on force, but only defensive force. You shouldn't be taking property by force. That would be aggressive force to acquire property. But if somebody comes on your property and they're dangerous or they're polluting it or whatever, they're going to kidnap someone or whatever their motivations are to destroy what you have, you are fully within your rights to defend that. And there's nothing wrong
Right.
that.
And I think a lot of people confuse libertarians with propertarians. Propertarians being those people that say that property rights are the end-all, be-all of human existence. Instead of, the inherent right of you have an inherent right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the propertarian would say you have a right to property, and anything that you derive from property you have a right to keep, but you don't necessarily have a right to live unless you can live on property that you own.
Free Talk Live, 7 nights a week from 7 to 10 Eastern, live on the Liberty Radio Network at LRN.FM.